All right, now I'm going to talk to you about incorporating quotations. This will be a little mini lecture. I'll also put up the slides so you can see them. What we need to know is that you'll usually have a quotation or two from a source or two sources in each body paragraph of your paper. A lot of you have already pulled those from your ILPs, and that's fine and great, so we're ahead of the game. I want to talk to you about introductory phrases, which is really how you incorporate the quotations and make sure they make sense. You don't always need these if you've cited the author several times, but what's really important is that you understand that they're being used for analysis. Remember we talked about reflective framing of our statistics, of our quotations. That's what we really need here. So I've got some examples. I'll read this first one. Young illustrates the difficulties faced by coal miners in West Virginia by writing, many miners developed severe lung problems and could never properly clean their faces or hands. That comes from page 68 of whatever book Young wrote. I made this up, so I don't think it's real. But it's telling our reader that we want them to focus on the difficulties faced by coal miners specifically. So our reader knows when they read that they should be thinking about the problems faced by coal miners, not necessarily the science of lung problems, not necessarily hygiene in coal mines, but what generally causes problems for coal miners. That's what we're looking at. I do want to remind you really quickly as we work on these that you need to be treating titles correctly when you write them. When you talk about sources, just call them by either their title or say like Young's novel or Strong's article. Don't call them this source. That's very confusing for your reader. I wrote that in a lot of your paper proposals, and it actually makes a lot of sense why you did it in the paper proposals, but don't do it in the paper because it will not make sense. The titles of articles, songs, poems, videos, other short pieces go in quotation marks. So, for example, Strong's article, Poison Frogs, claims that poison frogs look delicious but should not be eaten by mammals. The titles of books, if you've got books, should be in italics. So, Gramley's celebrated book, Animal Disagreements, records the tensions faced by many competing species in the wild. If you've got a chapter from a book, that also goes in quotation marks. Basically anything that is shorter than a book goes in quotation marks. If you're nervous and you don't know, go ahead and use quotation marks because chances are you'll be right. So a lot of you have already chosen your quotations, but I'm going to give you this advice regardless. If your author has written a sentence that you think communicates the argument really well, really succinctly, go ahead and quote it directly. If you want to use a bigger idea that comes from like an entire page or even a couple pages, you should paraphrase it. You still have to cite paraphrases, but it might look like putting it in parentheses, Jones 4 through 10. But then you can just put it in your own words, but still tell your reader where you got it. You're also allowed to use block quotes, so if your quotation takes up more than 4 lines of text, just indent it an inch. Don't use quotation marks. Put it in single space and still put the page number afterward. Your paper is pretty short and even shorter now that the epidemic has changed our requirements. So you shouldn't have more than 2 block quotes. It just isn't good for your paper. You do need to use all 8 of the sources you've found, but you don't have to quote them all. Some will only be paraphrased, and that's totally okay. So some of you have sources that are basically background sources for you that you don't necessarily need quotations from, but you'll still cite the paraphrases. So when you write lead-in, introductory, or signal phrases, all of these are the same thing. They all mean the part that explains why you're using the quotation. Basically, the formula for it is lead-in plus quotation plus citation. You can remember it that way. It may have some of the following information, like the author, the author's credentials, the name of the work, a summary of the claim, or information that situates the quotation in relation to your argument. If using these phrases at length is interrupting the flow of your argument, you can leave them out, but you need to make sure that within the context of the paragraph, we understand why we're seeing that quotation. So here's a basic example of that. The general consensus on global warming is expressed in geologist Wayne Bruce's book, Climate Change and You. It's clear that climate change is a real and urgent problem for the planet Earth. However, it's not clear what causes climate change or if its progress can be slowed. You should also always refer to authors by their last name, not their first name, except for the first time you talk about them, you can tell us their first and last name. This is more advice on lead-in phrases, but it's a little shorter and I think easier to look at. You can look at these in your own time and see what you're thinking, if you're getting it, how you feel about them, and then let me know if you have questions. And I wanted to remind you that lead-in phrases also work very well for countering. So you can say, I disagree with Dunn, who claims that this argument has no merit. In fact, it is important that the scientific community agree on the usefulness of turtle shells. This is understanding the countering between two different theorists. So Sims argues that no one really knows if turtles need their shells. Cryer is arguing that there is a scientific consensus that turtles do need their shells. And this quotation mark is backwards. Autocorrect did that for me. You'll need to reverse it if you do something like this. In terms of punctuation, you can pretty much do what you want regarding lead-in punctuation, do what feels most natural to you, but the most common ones are commas, colons, em dashes, and just a period because you've written a full introductory sentence. The word that also works really well. You'll notice in your paper proposals that I replaced a lot of your commas with the word that because I thought it worked better. So we've got Jones argues that down here at the bottom, or according to Jones, comma, or Jones argues from a different standpoint, and then a colon. You can use all of these. Em dashes are those long dashes. They're basically interchangeable with colons, so any place that you have a colon and want to change it to a dash, you can. There's no real difference. I've also got a little slide here about where you need to put these things. This is just a reminder that parenthetical citations always or most of the time go before the final period of the sentence. You can place them before a comma or a semicolon or a dash in the middle of the sentence if you want to indicate that the last half of the sentence is your own work. Sometimes people do that for countering purposes. If you've got a block quotation that's more than 4 lines long, indent at 1 inch, remove the quotation marks. And ellipses indicate omission, so if you want some of the quotation but not the whole thing, just put a space between 3 periods. The MLA is no longer requiring that ellipses be placed in brackets. I personally don't care if you put them in brackets or not, but you don't have to anymore. Right, I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go ahead and start